My name is Amy Dorman. I am a research manager with the Minnesota Justice Research Center, and I'm the lead evaluator for the Returning Home St. Paul pilot program, which works to house formerly incarcerated Black men through increasing access to resources through community partnerships. So we are in the middle of our evaluation right now, so we have about 1 year of preliminary learnings that we'll be sharing with you today, and then we have another year of evaluation to come. And for our session today, I'll be sharing some of these preliminary learnings and then turning a majority of our session to our panel. We have representatives from our partners at City of St. Paul, Ujamaa Place, and HousingLink here with us today. And then we'll leave some time at the end to get some of our audience questions as well. Can we get this on the big screen as well? There we go, perfect, thank you. So I want to start our session with a quote from one of our house participants. Being able to rent in my name, being able to live with my family when my son is born, to have a home has given me supreme security. I think the overarching story of returning home would just be hope and inspiration. It's changed my life perspective. So before I go through some of the program elements, I want us to understand some of the multifaceted challenges that individuals returning home from incarceration face when seeking out market rate housing. First, they experience frequent rejections based on the arbitrary 8 to 10-year look-back policy. They often experience additional difficulty securing employment, which can be a hindrance to first finding market rate housing and then also maintaining market rate housing over the long term. We also find that there's needed support in navigating the housing market as well as budgeting. So again, thinking about maintaining that housing over time through budgeting practices. And then an additional need for wraparound services, including mental health support due to the trauma of incarceration. So the Returning Home St. Paul program began enrollment in December 2020 and seeks to increase housing access through the coordination of resources by using community partnerships with our community organizations. It also seeks to bridge the transition from reentry to self-sufficiency through wraparound services and case management. And then also on the landlord side to mitigate perceived risks through an access fund that's administered through one of our community partners, HousingLink. Additional design elements are that this is a community-based access point to the program. So participants enter Returning Home St. Paul through partnership with Ujamaa Place and receive that supportive services and case management through Ujamaa Place throughout their enrollment in the program. There's also housing navigational support through HousingLink, which includes landlord connectivity, and then financial support for participants as well as for landlords. The financial support for participants has some flexibility based on need and includes coverage for application fees, security deposits, and at times portions of first month's rent depending on the needs assessment. And on the landlord side, the Housing Access Fund can cover up to $3,000 of damage that exceeds normal wear and tear and exceeds the security deposit. And this is administered by our partner, HousingLink. So looking at our partners, we have the City of St. Paul, which serves as a coordinating body for the project. They're the ones that bring together the community partnerships, help us maintain the partner relationships, and also provide pragmatic support. HousingLink provides a platform, it's a nonprofit in Minnesota that provides a free platform for landlords to list affordable housing options in Minnesota. And as part of the partnership, they serve to provide those housing opportunities, landlord connectivity, and also are the access fund administrator for the landlords. On the participant side, we have Ujamaa Place as our partner, and they provide participant case management and consistent wraparound support throughout their enrollment in the program. And then the Minnesota Justice Research Center is the evaluation partner. And so our role is to talk to landlords, participants, and partners to better identify gaps, what's working, what's not, and then to provide recommendations to the City of St. Paul at different points along the way. Returning Home St. Paul is a community-first public safety initiative, and the city describes this framework in this way. It's a framework that seeks to transcend crime response by building compelling violence reduction strategies, which are informed by deep public engagement, research, tracking and analysis of real-time data, and cross-sector collaboration of stakeholders. So all of these elements are a part of the Returning Home St. Paul pilot. The framework is further broken down into two different categories: response to crime and crisis, and then proactive investments in residents and neighborhoods. And this proactive investment in residents is where the Returning Home St. Paul program fits in under the evidence-based crime reduction, where we understand from other studies that having secure and stable housing can help reduce recidivism over time. So who are our participants? Our participants who have been housed through the program range from 23 to 37 years old. Their most recent offenses range from 0 to 3 years to 8 to 10 years ago. So we have folks who are coming directly from incarceration to enroll in the program and to seek housing, but we also have individuals who have been a part of the community for many years and still experience barriers to accessing market rate housing. Importantly, many of our participants are fathers, and some are the primary caregivers to their children, and this helps us to look at how important it is to experience not only impacts on the individual level, but expanding to the family, community, and ultimately looking at generational impacts over time. So when we look high level at the numbers of the Returning Home St. Paul pilot program, over the enrollment period, we have 12 participants who were housed through program efforts. 2 participants have since had their leases ended prior to the 12-month program benchmark. 9 landlords have housed participants through the program process, which means that several landlords are actually housing multiple participants through participation in the program. And we have over 40 interested landlords who have been added to a St. Paul-specific pipeline, which is managed by HousingLink. On the financial side, just under $60 was used to pay for application fees for 1 participant. Most participants pay for their own application fees, and we've heard over time that participants have spent hundreds upon hundreds of dollars on application fees that end up being rejected anyway, often due to that 8 to 10-year arbitrary look-back policy. In terms of security deposits and other fees that have been paid, just under $6,500 has been spent to help house participants. And participants have mentioned how important it has been to have this financial support as they move into market rate housing. It's helped them be able to start saving, especially for their children. It's helped them to provide for their children in terms of diapers and other needs, to buy furniture, to reduce their debt. So having this financial support up front has been really helpful in moving them into this next chapter as renters. On the landlord side, there's been $0 of the Access Fund dispersed to landlords at this point in the pilot program. So we know that there are financial costs when it comes to seeking housing as well as maintaining housing, but there are also time and emotional costs. So when we look behind the scenes, we've seen that participants made an average of 18 calls to individual landlords before securing housing. We also heard that partners, HousingLink and Ujamaa Place, worked up to 20 hours per week, or the equivalent of a part-time job, helping participants find housing. And it has taken an average of 2.5 months for participants to find housing while being enrolled in the program, with one individual taking up to 6 months. So as we look at our preliminary learnings from this 1-year check-in point of the pilot program, we hear consistently that participants have felt hopeful, supported, and an increased sense of stability since being housed through the program. And this extends beyond themselves to their children and their families. One participant talks about this impact this way: "I have 3 kids. Being involved in incarceration and all that stuff, I missed out on their lives. Now I get an opportunity to actually be in one of my kids' lives from start to finish. So that's one of my goals, just to make sure that I'm here for him every step of the way." And this individual was actually able to move his child out of foster care and into his own care when he secured housing through the program. As this is a community-first public safety initiative, it's important for us to look at things like reoffenses and recidivism, and we find that over 82% of participants have not reoffended since enrolling in the program. So 2 participants had parole violations, were briefly reincarcerated for a few weeks, and have since returned home. But it's also important to note that Minnesota data also often defines recidivism as having a new felony conviction within 3 years, and none of our participants have had a new felony conviction since being a part of the program. When we look at cost and financial learnings, the pilot has spent just under $6,500 to house participants and $0 of the risk mitigation fund for landlords at this point. So this is a relatively small dent in terms of what the city is paying to house individuals. A majority of the funds of the program goes to programmatic support, so supporting the human resources from our organizations that help to keep everything moving effectively. One of the quotes from our participants talk about how important this impact has been for them. They covered the application fee, first month's rent, all of that. There's innumerable ways that I can describe how helpful that was because I have a baby daughter and another one on the way. Me and my girl want to save at least $3,000 before the end of the year, potentially start a Roth IRA or some type of savings for my son and my daughter. We have found, however, that even though that upfront funds was really helpful for participants, almost all of them have struggled to pay their rent since moving into market rent housing. So all but one of our participants has applied to programs like Rent Help Minnesota, which was established during COVID-19, or other community organizations for assistance with rent. When we look at our relational learnings, we find that once a landlord is willing to house someone with barriers in their backgrounds, the specific offenses become less of a deal breaker. So we have individuals in our program who have some of the hardest to house offenses, but they were able to be housed once the connections were made within the program and with support from our community partners, and being able to see the person as an individual, have a conversation, hear their story, and then move them into housing. We also found that all of our landlords who have house participants as part of the program have already had a history of working with this population, with folks with barriers in their backgrounds. We also find that the market moves fast, and so timing is incredibly critical, and one of the ways to mitigate any lost opportunities due to this fast pace of the market is to make sure partner relationships are strong and that we have communication loops, particularly between Ujamaa Place and HousingLink, to be able to facilitate the entry of an individual into market rate housing. So one landlord describes his involvement in the program like this. It's a great opportunity to build rapport with Ujamaa and the city of St. Paul and connect some more. I want to continue to get more properties and give a hand to whoever needs it. As we continue our evaluation, there are several structural barriers that we're continuing to see. The first is the tenant screening policy that I've mentioned before, the 8 to 10-year look-back policy for landlords. We also see that background is a barrier to both employment and housing, and that these two things are very interconnected and can serve as a barrier to housing as well as to keeping housing. We also see a continuous lack of holistic wraparound services for residents returning home, including healthcare, mental health care, and importantly, childcare. So we hear from our individuals who are primary caregivers that finding childcare has been very difficult and can at times make their employment situation that much more difficult, and so that also can jeopardize ultimately their housing situation as well. Finally, we heard about the financial impacts of COVID-19, including lost employment and lost wages. Most of these individuals are in temporary positions without benefits, and that means that when COVID did close down different parts of the industries, that they ended up losing and having to eat into their savings during this time. So one participant talks about COVID in this way. COVID affected my life dramatically because now I'm in debt. When I came home from prison, I wasn't in debt. When COVID happened, that's when everything started to pile up. So as we look forward, the enrollment of the program ended in March 2022, so we're in that second phase of evaluation. House participants will continue to receive support through the program for the 12 months of their lease period. An evaluation is anticipated to continue through spring 2023, and this will give us a better understanding of the final cost of the program per participant, final amount of the access fund that's dispersed to landlords over this time, final housing outcomes and recidivism outcomes, and impacts for participants and landlords after 12 months of the program. We do have a one-year check-in report that is available. It's on the Returning Home St. Paul website. The QR code will take you there. If you want to take a picture of it, it will take you to that website, which is also nested under the City of St. Paul website. And it's also available at the Minnesota Justice Research Center website at MNJRC.org. And so with that, we'll move to our panel discussion. So I am going to take a seat, and then we have some wonderful questions for our community partners here today. And then at the end, we'll make sure that we'll leave time for some of your questions as well. So hi, everyone.
Hi.
We have just met each other in person for the first time today, even though we've been working together for a long time, so this has been fun. But first, I would like to start by having everyone introduce themselves. So if you can tell me your name, title and organization, and your role in the partnership. So Muneer, let's start with you, and then we'll go down the line.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Muneer Karcher-Ramos. I'm the director of the Office of Financial Empowerment with the City of St. Paul. And the role in this is that Returning Home St. Paul is within the department, that I run and manage. And a former colleague here put this together. Kristen Birch is in the crowd. She moved to a new organization now, but it falls within our fair housing work within the Office of Financial Empowerment.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Andre Knight, and I'm representing Ujamaa Place. I'm a high-tech contacts coach there at Ujamaa Place. I work with participants in this program, and really looking forward to the continuation.
Yes. Is this too close? Thank you for joining in on this panel and listening to the presentation. Hello, everyone. I'm Kahari Smith-Brewer. I am the outreach coordinator at HousingLink. I primarily do landlord outreach, trying to connect them to HousingLink as an organization, but also trying to involve them with our Beyond Backgrounds clients as well, not only with the Ujamaa Place and Returning Home St. Paul, but also our other partnerships as well.
Great. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to start with a few questions about our program itself, and then we'll move into talking about some of the things that we've been learning along the way as partners. So the Returning Home St. Paul pilot is part of the City of St. Paul's Community First Public Safety Initiative. And Muneer, could you tell us a bit about what drove the city's decision to create a pilot focused specifically on market rate housing for residents returning home from incarceration?
Yeah, so just want to do a couple more shout outs in the room, just other City of St. Paul folks who helped put us together. So I already mentioned Kristen Birch. I want to name Rachel Walsh, who's, wave your hands like, yeah. Yep, there you go. And then Mike Salmond, our city treasurer as well, who helped, put these different programs together. So, so the City of St. Paul, we have a number of pillars, that we looked at, and I know many of you heard Mayor Carter speak yesterday around, how do we bet on folks, right? How do we really do what we can and not wait, for everything to be perfect before we get going. And part of that strategy is really at the intersection of two of the pillars of our work, which are economic justice and community first public safety. So as the City of St. Paul thought about this framework of community first public safety, was that the City of St. Paul isn't going to solve issues that we're working on, by ourselves, right? So for it to be community first, you actually have to be working, in lockstep, with community partners, hence Ujamaa Place, HousingLink, Minnesota Justice, Research Center. And that the next piece was then thinking about what the different populations we're actually trying to, reach. So what does it mean for residents returning from incarceration? And what do we know are some of the barriers that they're facing? And as Amy's pointed out, is there's a connection between recidivism and housing, right? And that if you are not housed, there is an increased possibility, that folks may, recidivate or, get rearrested or return back, to incarceration. So for us, this pilot is really a probe, right? To say, what is the new way that the City of St. Paul can interface both with our community partners, but also interface with residents returning, from incarceration. And when this project was being developed, at the core was the Beyond Backgrounds program with HousingLink, which is really that, mitigation fund. And we really, as we went through the process, we had a Bloomberg Philanthropies partnership to really sort of take a human-centered design approach to this and engage with residents returning from incarceration. Said, what else would you need? And that's where it was the support from Ujamaa Place, adding on, if you need it, these ability to pay the application fees, the security deposits, and looking at, how are those assets, leading to sort of, longer-term assets around housing stability and sort of the pathway there. So we got into it, got into the space, using this probe, and really it's sort of what's the line of sight, based off the learnings on, how do we want to scale this? How do we want to grow this? And I think even more importantly is, there was the $0 that has been tapped in, into the fund, which is if, those supposed to be used for things like damaged property or, evictions or that. So that zero number going to that landlord mitigation or being spent on that landlord mitigation fund is a good thing. And there's tropes, right? Racist tropes, classist tropes about residents returning from incarceration that I think that we're also looking to disprove, through Returning Home St. Paul, that housing folks returning from incarceration shouldn't be a bad or a scary thing, and it should be, in our minds, from a values perspective, nonsensical, right? That would be the case, but the tropes and the mental models that so many folks hold around those returning from incarceration is also sort of the underlying thing that we're really trying to address. And, for us, if, we don't have to spend money on, the mitigation fund, what does that actually mean for us to cast, use some of those dollars to recast, new narratives around residents returning from incarceration in St. Paul?
Thank you for providing insight into that whole beginning process. And you're also pointing to just the really fluid phase that we're in terms of where are we going, what are we thinking about, what are we dreaming about. But we also know that at the beginning of this whole project, COVID happened to our state. And so there were huge impacts in terms of housing for landlords as well as for participants, and then also for the program itself. So I'm going to start with you, Kahari. What have you seen in terms of how COVID-19 has impacted the housing market? And obviously this is a multi-year span now, and landlords in St. Paul.
Yeah. Well, of course, everyone knows that the housing market took a pretty big hit during COVID, not only for renters, but landlords as well, especially the eviction moratorium, where a renter could not be removed or evicted from a property due to unpaid rent. So, of course, we had the quote from one of the individuals that we assisted, how COVID put them in debt. They were not in debt prior to COVID, and then I'm assuming all of a sudden they couldn't work. They had all these things that they had to pay for, and COVID put them in debt. So, of course, they're not going to be able to pay rent, are going to have a lot of trouble keeping up with those finances. And we all understand that processes, laws were put in place for that. On the landlord side of that, they were not receiving rent. And we all assume, and we all have this perception that landlords can probably afford to miss out on a few months' rent if it means keeping someone in their home. That was the idea. But a lot of these landlords that specifically beyond backgrounds are HousingLink as an organization, we like to target the smaller mom and pop landlords, as we like to call them, the single property family owners who have one house maybe, and that they rent out, and that helps them pay the mortgage of the home that they live in, or maybe they're renting themselves and just own this house and rent it out. So they are missing out on that as well. And when there are no services, no funding, nothing that is going towards assisting them in any capacity, it kind of makes it harder. They get this mean edge to them about that idea that all this assistance is going towards the renter and not towards them in any capacity, which we did take advantage of, or not take advantage of, but we tried to harbor a goodwill with the landlords during that time. Usually, risk fund claims can't be made until the end of a lease. The idea is that in the event that the renter during the lease term couldn't pay rent and there's rent due at the end of the lease, or they damage the property and the landlord does an inspection and discovers damage to the property and needs funding, they do that once the lease has ended. In an attempt to help landlords and keep renters in their units during that eviction moratorium, we did allow for landlords to request access to funding for unpaid rent to just to harbor a good relationship between the renter who was unable to afford the rent at the time and the landlord who was not receiving any payment. So things like that is very important. There was the Zero Balance Project in Minnesota. There were statewide or national-wide funding made available to other landlords as well. So there were things that were done primarily to keep renters in their homes, but the lack of actual assistance to the landlords did harbor some negative feelings that could progress into the future when they say, well, I don't want to rent to an individual who has barriers in their background. I don't want to rent to low-income individuals because when the going gets tough, they're not going to afford anything. They can't afford anything. So we want to try to make sure that we keep that mindset at bay. We don't want to harbor any poor relationships with the landlords, and that's what programs like this kind of try to do. So very large impact, but hopefully things like this can prevent that from being a longer issue.
Andre, what have you heard in terms of participants and the impacts that they were facing during COVID-19 and how that maybe hindered them from being able to move into market rate housing?
Well, from an organization standpoint, it affected our participants because while we were open, we only closed but one day during COVID. But a lot of our programming was affected. A lot of guys couldn't come in and do their one-on-ones, and with our participants, they thrive on the one-on-one besides the virtual. It also affected our programming as far as our evening program had to be cut. We provide warm meals twice a day for men. We had to take that away, so that hit men's pockets. From an employment standpoint, as you said in your presentation, they lost jobs. And a lot of our men are stuck in the behavior of trying to find an out when it's committed to working. And so that affected them. They went for that out. They went for that COVID relief money. And so their behaviors of being committed to working stopped, which is affect them to be able to pay market rate rent. And so they weren't able to. As Kahari mentioned, from a landlord standpoint, it was impossible for a landlord to say a yes to us, an acceptance, because they felt that they would come in financially on the short end of the stick. And so without programs like we're running, RHSP, it was impossible to find rent. And so it affected our guys on that emotional standpoint, that financial standpoint, that support standpoint, and they're still now trying to recover from that.
Absolutely. So we're seeing a lot of complexities in terms of how this pilot was launched. But Muneer, can you tell us a little bit about how the COVID actually impacted the launch itself of the pilot program and what that looked like in the initial stages?
I think we were supposed to launch in March of 2020, and story be told that didn't happen, right? And all the things that were mentioned here, sort of delayed that, and we were able to launch, in late fall, early winter, of 2020, and have been at it, for a year.
Absolutely. Thank you. So one of the key learnings from our one-year check-in was the importance of establishing a strong communication loop between Ujamaa Place and HousingLink. That's one of the big central pieces of this session, strengthening these community partnerships. So Kahari, could you share with us a bit about why this communication was so important, especially given your knowledge of how the housing market works?
So that line of communication, not only between HousingLink and Ujamaa Place or HousingLink and whatever partnership we have, it is very important to keep that link open and viable, because there are individuals that we are trying to assist, these renters who usually are in a crisis mode a lot of the times. They need housing as fast as possible. They usually might need financial assistance with security deposits, first month's rent. Trying to stay up to date on all of that information is very important. It's very easy for all the individuals that we try to assist for them to fall behind, I suppose, in regards to our radar, because we're trying to help as many people as possible. So when we lose that connection, when we lose that line of communication, then it's difficult to help them when they need it. So it's keeping that communication open with not only the partners, HousingLink and Ujamaa Place, but the renters as well. And then that helps us keep that communication line with the landlords up to date too, because the market moves fast. Landlords, they post their listings, and a lot of the times they find someone within a week. They get tons of calls every day from interested renters, and they have to screen all of that. And a lot of them, especially with the smaller ones, the mom and pop properties, they're doing it on their own. They're doing it by themselves. So they're going to try to get whoever they can as fast as they can. So the idea is, since HousingLink operates our website where landlords can post that information and we get alerts to that instantaneously, the idea is that if we know that there's a renter with Ujamaa Place who's ready to find a place, who's ready to sign as soon as possible, and then there's a landlord who's looking immediately for a renter who can fill that space, and we try to make that connection as quickly as we can, because they will move on. They won't wait for a week for a call from the renter just because they're working with Beyond Backgrounds. We would like for them to, but that's not always the case. So, and to ensure that the renter can get housed as soon as possible, we have to keep that line of communication open.
Absolutely. Andre, what's your take on this communication channel?
Yeah, let me just add, Kahari and HousingLink was vital in us housing our participants. We were faced with so many rejections. Guys was losing hope. It was at a point where I was losing hope. And this gentleman right here, lifted me up, lifted us up, the participants, and the timing was perfect. And so my preparation with the participants and preparing them to be ready to set and letting them understand that the timing is important, we're ready to go, and Kahari providing us with the resources of landlords, it was just awesome. So thank you again, brother, for helping us doing that.
It's nothing at all. Thank you, because we at HousingLink, we don't have the capacity to do the one-on-one assistance that Ujamaa Place is able to do. We have the connections to landlords, we have that information, but they are working with them all hours of the day. Stuff that we can't do ourselves. And while we, myself, have interactions with renters, I reach out to them, I try to connect with them and try to harbor that relationship with them and the landlord. It is Ujamaa Place who does a lot of the work.
And just let me expand on that, Amy. Your data was vital with helping us as well, because you would track everything when we did house a participant, you would track how that took place. And so we would pull from some of the keys from that to go out and seek other landlords. So all our partners had their fingerprints on these participants being housed.
It takes a team, doesn't it?
Yes.
It absolutely takes a team. So Andre, as you were speaking, you lifted up a little bit of some of the challenges and the struggles of actually securing housing. But we also found over time that it was very difficult to maintain housing as well, in terms of a majority of our participants needing to reach out for rental assistance, 2 of our participants ending their leases early. What can you tell us about some of these challenges, and what do you think is needed going forward to support participants?
Yeah, most of our participants are coming from a place of homelessness. They're coming out of shelters or incarceration. So having their own apartment was the least thing that they knew about. And so we had to begin coaching from a standpoint of budgeting. We had to do a coaching on cleaning, what it's like to live and come into a community living. You can't blast your music. You can't do what you want. This is not that type of environment. And so on the front end, the coaching was vital. And at first going into this, I thought that would be the heavy lifting. But the heavy lifting is after you've housed them, because here's guys who've never paid bills before. Here's guys who never went shopping before. And so all of that had to be played out. And to this point, maintaining all that so they can maintain their houses is really important. And so the weekly check-ins, the weekly phones, the weekly going over to their places to just look and say, hey, what is this like? How do I report this drawer that's not working? Okay, let's fill out this maintenance report. And so it takes a lot of work on the front end, but I'm really realizing now the back end is going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources.
Absolutely, and that's something that we're exploring as we think about where this pilot can go and what it can look like in terms of policy and programmatic changes going forward. So also, when we look at the monetary investment of the program thus far, we see that only a fraction of the program funds have actually been used to support application fees, security deposits, et cetera, for participants. And so far, as we've mentioned, $0 of that risk mitigation fund has actually been requested by landlords. So instead, a majority of these funds are really going into that programmatic support piece. So Muneer, what does this mean for the city in terms of investment as we think about being a part of the Community First Public Safety Framework and that ultimate goal of asset building?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's lots of things to consider in this space, right? So, like I mentioned before, if we're not using money on the actual fund, because a lot of the folks are, staying housed, and there aren't, all these damages and, evictions and, all these other, again tropes, that would be out there of, residents returning from incarceration. I think it is really sort of, we're looking at, safe and affordable, checking and savings accounts, credit builders. We're looking at, getting folks, supported, in, ways that continue to stabilize their lives, and really also think about what's that pathway, to, the baseline, of sort of, building assets. So, we, I think learning for us is, how do you recast some of these dollars, when, the initial investment was like, there's a lot of money that's going to be spent, in this contingency fund when that's actually not the case, and that's a good thing, right? I think for us, the way we think about it, and this is going to be, sourced, from the folks in the program, but the way we think about it is really what is that second chance benefits package that folks need, and what is the policy sort of framework that needs to follow it so that folks, as they, return from incarceration or go through their sort of journey of, navigating, the different, barriers and boundaries, that are set up, what is that second chance benefits package that would be most helpful, and how do you actually codify that, into a policy framework, not just for the city of St. Paul, but beyond. And I think a lot of that, again, will be sourced, from program participants. And I think, again, if we're looking at this as sort of a pilot or a probe, how do you actually learn from it? I think a lot of times we're not able to do this at scale. We're calling it a pilot because it's at small scale. But I think this is actually how do you harvest those learnings and, really think about what are those second chance benefits that, put people on to a further path of asset building while they have some stability.
Absolutely. Kahari, you've also talked quite a bit about the mitigation fund and what this looks like, particularly from your experience with Beyond Backgrounds. So I want to ask, what do you really see in terms of landlords calling in these funds through Beyond Backgrounds, and what does that indicate about the renters with barriers in their backgrounds?
Yes, so just to highlight the fact that no funds have been claimed since the start of this partnership with Ujamaa Place. That is very important. Of course, once we reach the spring of 2023, we can really get an idea of if those funds ever become claimed in any capacity once the current house clients graduate and complete their first year lease. But to break away from Returning Home St. Paul, and Beyond Backgrounds, in general, we, since its inception in 2017, we have housed over 500 individuals working with various programs, agencies within the metro area, and most recently going statewide, but that over 500 is not included in that. Within that time frame and that number of individuals who have been housed, only 3% of the landlords who have housed them requested any funding, and a great chunk of that was during the eviction moratorium, like we said, where we allowed landlords to request funding to keep renters in their households. So the actual number of risk funds, of claims made for the risk fund is 16. So 16 out of over 500. So it's quite amazing how little it has to be used. And even to highlight another stat, only about 49% of landlords even choose to participate in the Beyond Backgrounds program. What that means is have access to the financial assurance that's offered. So that means that being made aware that the renter is a part of Beyond Backgrounds, being made aware that that financial assurance is offered, they still deny that assistance. We can't say exactly why every single landlord does it. It is a mixture of just not wanting to fill out the forms that we need, but sometimes it's because, and they have said this, that they don't feel like the individual that they are housing, regardless of whatever barrier it might be. It could be as simple as low credit. It could be as extreme as a felony or criminal history of some sort. They say that they don't feel like that individual that they're renting to, because they've had that relationship, they've had that communication with them, is as much of a risk as they might think, to the point where they feel like they need access to that financial assurance. So they refuse it in that regard, which is completely fine to us. It's not an obligation that it's offered to them. So it kind of highlights this idea that it is not just the barriers in the background. It is not just the low credit, the low income, or what have you, that makes someone high risk, and it's kind of shows bias of the perceptions that landlords have of renters. They see them only as a background check. They see them as a report on a screen, and then they make all the assumptions that they need to about these individuals. Where if they just spoke with them, understood their situation, understood where they were coming from, and saw that they just needed a bit more support, then they would be able to be viable and lucrative renters in regards to the landlord. So I think that's the most important aspect of all of it.
I think you're really describing some of the strengths of the program in terms of that relationship building, not only between partners, but with landlords as well. I know that you've both done a lot of work making sure that you're staying in touch with our landlords, keeping the landlord pipeline strong, and Andre, as a case manager for our participants, staying in good contact with landlords, and then having landlords reach out and say, hey, we have a unit. Do you have another person who's available who wants to rent? And so that relationship building is a really central part of this program. I want to use our last two questions, maybe one, we'll see how it goes with our responses, before we open it up to our audience. But I'd like to go down the line and hear what has been one of your key takeaways as partners from working on the Returning Home St. Paul program over the last year. So Andre, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yep. Key word for me and from my participants is hope. It provided hope. A lot of our participants felt like they had a life sentence. They know that they made a bad decision, and they felt that they paid their debt to society. But they in trying to acquire a safe and stable housing, they felt like, hey, I am labeled forever. And so it gave them hope. It gave them hope to say, hey, I can put my past behind me. I'm moving forward. I'm in my community. I can be an integral part of my community, and I can live like everyone else live and raise my family. So the hope that was instilled with this program, not only for my participants, but for me. I mean, it brought me so much joy to see guys signing their lease with their mom there and their children there, and they're in their apartments, and feeling like, hey, I've accomplished something. And so now I can build on this. So hope was the key word I took away from it.
That's great. Thank you, Andre. Kahari, what about you?
Yes. I believe what I learned most, or what I take away from this the most, is the need for collaboration and understanding. Collaboration and understanding in regards to the renter, the landlord, and any organizations or agencies that are involved in that pairing. Understanding on the landlord's side that everybody has the potential to go through things in life that might be a hindrance, and it should only be a hindrance at that time. Individuals who are incarcerated or face incarceration should not have to drag that incarceration with them everywhere they go for the rest of their life. Understanding that you would be hard pressed to find anyone who could handle being homeless, for 3 years, let alone almost 8 years, having trouble finding housing for themselves or their families. So it's understanding that sometimes all someone needs is a little help. So that's probably what I would take away the most.
That's good.
Muneer?
I think the greatest lesson for me is probably like perfection is the enemy of greatness. I want us to be great and not perfect. And, you know, as someone who's always looking to, from a policy perspective at the city, like scale, right? But scale isn't always about the numbers. It's about depth, right? And I think hearing the narrative, you know, in our conversations, and I have a bias to action versus a bias, you know, to learning. So in this sort of pilot was situating myself in like bias to learning while we're still, you know, moving forward. We try to launch this in the middle of a pandemic, you know, but then, you know, having sort of the texture, you know, from our reports, you know, from participants, and like, if you read the report, you know, you get the real voices, you know, of, you know, the different folks in the program, but, you know, also hearing from Andre and Kahari, you know, of like, this is, you know, the realities here, right? And sort of recontextualizing from, you know, just thinking about a scalable policy perspective, and just saying the depth in this can also be the scale, as, you know, I hear Andre, you know, today mention, you know, supporting the men, who haven't necessarily gone shopping before, right? Or, haven't signed the lease before and that. So taking the moment sort of from the public official side of me to take a slow down, and, reconnect, with the realities, sort of on the ground. And then for us, the question is, well, what does that mean, then for the future of, returning home St. Paul? So I think for me, sort of the you have an ideal in your head of like what it looks like, but once you open up to sort of the learning side of it and ask the questions, and I think that's where we pivoted as convener, was to say, let's do our root cause analysis. What's happening here, right? And being open, to slow down and, resituate ourselves, to reorient ourselves, based off sort of the realities of, in this instance, what, these men in these programs need.
Absolutely. So thinking about flexibility, thinking about learning, hope, partnership, all very central to what we've shared with you today. But it's time for us to open up to some questions. So I don't know if we might need a portable microphone to walk around if folks have some questions, but this is now your time for the panel. You can raise a hand and...
A number of questions. Maybe Madeline, if you wanted to run the mic.
Thanks. I was just curious, I'll stand up. Are there similar programs around the country that you modeled this off of? I'm just sort of interested how the partnership was formed. Were there other programs that you were looking at, and are there similar evaluations going on there? And is there a body of work that this is all part of? Thanks.
Yeah. No, we did not model it off of. I'm not aware of any other things similar to Beyond Backgrounds. I know I've heard of programs that offered some sort of insurance of some sort to landlords. That's kind of county-wide, not necessarily larger than that, but definitely not on the scale of that. And I know that when HousingLink created Beyond Backgrounds, it was based off of their observations of assisting renters who locate affordable housing, but then saw that they were still not being approved for these properties due to the things that were in their past. So not built off of anything like that, but maybe the specific partnership with Ujamaa Place, maybe that was created off of something, but was Kirsten created that idea. So I think she would be able to answer it if she was up here, but yeah. And was there a second part to that question, or did I answer everything?
This sounds like a very local or regional effort. I'm curious whether there's been any engagement or response at the state level from the Department of Corrections or others. And as you think about some of these lessons learned or kind of where you go from here, are there specific state level policies that you think need to be changed in order to better support the work that you're all doing?
Thank you for that question. So I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. So one of the systemic barriers that Amy lifted up, was the 8 to 10 year look back in the tenant screening process. So that'd be if you had, some sort of conviction, in the past 8 to 10 years, it would be possible for, landlords to deny you based off of, what shows up on your background report. In the city of St. Paul, we developed a suite of tenant protections that got addressed, that addressed actually this tenant screening, background issue. And, depending on the different convictions, we moved it back, between, was it 3 to 5 years, kind of depending on, the different, types of convictions that actually got slammed down in court. And then it just got heard again by the 8th Circuit, which is the circuit, the U.S. federal court system, that were located in Minnesota, and they upheld it, in Minneapolis with a different provision. So we'll be going back, and looking sort of at tenant screening. Tenant screening could happen at the city level. It could also happen, scaled up at the state level. Second part of that, is, well, what is the role of the state? State government, whether it's the Department of Corrections, Department of Human Services, the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and others. And I think what we're thinking here, is, yes, we're in relationship with those folks, and I think they're looking at, well, what's the prototype that comes out of, St. Paul, so that there could be a broader kind of state policy play as we go deeper with the Minnesota Department of Corrections, Department of Human Services, and the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. So I think what's at stake is that, part of why we're investing in sort of the research and evaluation is to look at those pieces, right, and look at sort of the different policy provisions, different programmatic provisions, that can inform not just, City of St. Paul policy, but statewide policy writ large.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm from Milwaukee, and outside of my day job, I also organize with queer incarcerated folks in Wisconsin and as part of a Midwest coalition. So it's really cool and incredible to hear about this type of work, especially as you outlined, housing is really difficult to access. I guess speaking of hope and community partnerships, could you maybe speak about what your hopes are for your program moving forward? And maybe more specifically, do you anticipate expanding access and community partnerships to include women and trans folks?
I'm not entirely sure about the specific partnership with Ujamaa Place or where that will go. We have ideas, we have discussed it internally about what we would like, what this means for the program potentially moving forward. I know that we're beyond backgrounds through HousingLink or with HousingLink. We offer it statewide, and any individual who any renter who is looking for housing but has barriers in their past, they can apply. So we have opened that up. We launched that statewide initiative in March of this year. So we've been active with that for 3 months, and we already have had over 2,000 applicants. 1,000 of them actually accessing the financial assurance or having access to utilize that as an incentive. So we have been expanding, whether it expands more or whether or not that means more direct partnerships, like we have with Ujamaa Place, where we assist individuals who are not just black men, where we specifically assist other areas. That could be something that happens in the future, but as it stands, we do offer the actual Beyond Backgrounds program to everyone.
And then to address your question sort of on the queer and trans folks, we know that queer and trans folks are disproportionately criminalized, and then we also know they're disproportionately experiencing homelessness as a result of being pushed out, of housing. So while it's not right here in the immediacy of the plan, if it is connected right now, our queer and trans folks, have some sort of criminal history or criminal background, where they've been criminalized in different ways, shapes, or forms, like they would qualify, for the program. And I think for the City of St. Paul, as we look at, different communities, different populations, I think that's definitely a space where we need to, continue to grow and figure out what is, partnership look like, within sort of the queer and trans community.
And as far as Ujamaa Place, one of our main goals is to keep our participants away from the criminal justice system and the penal system. And so it is really imperative that a program like this continues, because as Amy said in her presentation, a lack of having a safe and stable housing will lead to you reoffending. And so I would be grateful for this continuation, because it's been so integral part of helping our men transform. And so their transformation included housing was a big part that was included in their transformation. And so having a program like this maintained would be just awesome for our guys' transformation.
We have time for maybe one, possibly two more questions if they're out there.
I just want to start off by saying thank you guys very much for taking time out of your day to present for us today. My name's Azam. My question to you, it's segueing a little bit away from housing for these incarcerated members and so forth. Have you guys thought about any initiative about, trying to help provide them education after they have been incarcerated? I only bring this to your attention because I just read an article a few weeks ago. There was like a woman that got a life sentence and she got enrolled into a law school, and she's taking classes while in prison and stuff like that. But is there any other initiatives or ideas in the future that you guys plan on focusing on education? I know the main goal is housing, but anything in regards to education?
Yeah, let me touch on that. Ujamaa Place was initially started focusing on men coming out of incarceration and men just merely not having a pathway to their life. But it was started on finding men getting their GED because they realized that not having your GED would not allow you to have employment. And so after realizing that, they expanded that not only you need education, but you need other surrounding support areas in housing, employment, mental health. And so we provide opportunity for men to obtain their GED or to go and try to get, if you do have your high school diploma, you can go get college, you can go and expand on your education. And so that is set up and that is vital in our transformation of our men. So you're absolutely right. Education was a big key of a lot of our guys coming out of incarceration. And so providing that is very important. And that's what Ujamaa Place does.
We have time for another question, if you're out there. If not, let's spend our last 3 minutes. I'd like to hear from each of you quickly. We've got 3 minutes. What one recommendation would be from what you've learned over the year of this program for folks who are working in this space, whether it's in the collaborative space, thinking about housing, asset building, all of those pieces? What's one recommendation that you would give to the folks in this room? Andre, let's start with you.
I would say when you encounter an individual person, please encounter them with a non-judgmental type of mindset. People have made mistakes in their life and people have paid for those mistakes and people will move on. We've had so many success stories with transformation with our guys that if you would look on them as paper, you would look at them with a sad thought saying, oh, what happened? Where did this person land at? But these guys are contributing members of society and they're family men. And they can come in this room right here and they would talk to you and they would light this room up. And so my learning from those guys has been very beneficial for me as a man and as a dad and as a husband. And so please move with compassion and non-judgmental type of a way.
Kahari.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that if you are in housing or if you work with individuals in any capacity in which you are trying to assist them in finding housing, it is important to stress the process, the housing search process, for any individual, not only ones who might have barriers in their past, but it is important to stress how much work and time that takes. Teach them the housing search process, that you have to reach out to a lot of properties. You really have to be on it if you want to find a place to live. People who don't have barriers in the background still have to call upwards of 20 places just to find a place that they are interested in and that will accept them. So that will probably be my main. Also, that there's not a cure-all to every element, to every to just housing, like Andre said, that it started as individuals just needing education. to help them find employment. But then you also have to find a place to live, and you're not going to find a place to live just because you have your GED. And then you're not going to get a job just because you have, find a place to live. There's all these things, and then there's financial assistance. So helping these individuals find all of these resources is very important, not just one or the other.
Muneer?
And then I would say, I would encourage people to hold contempt for the narratives about residents returning from incarceration, right? And be angry and infuriated at the mental models that have been crafted around folks returning from incarceration, right? When Kahari shared only 3% in this risk insurance pool, right, that has been, created, it's had been used, right? It rubs directly against, these tropes that are out there about folks, who have criminal backgrounds, right? And as you talk to the men, if you talk to others, that doesn't mean, again, 3%, it's small, it's a relatively small number, but in the bigger thing is like talking to folks, returning from incarceration, they want to be stabilized. They want to be housed, right? And I want to say that, if we didn't ever have to create the risk pool, right, like we should hold contempt, around, that it exists and, work on the narrative side, the policy side, the programmatic side, so residents from incarceration are fully supported.
Yeah, looks good.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session and for your questions. If we could do a quick round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you.